I've always loved the circus, really. Whenever a circus comes to my hometown of Bluebell Crossing in Indiana, I go and take my whole family with me. That said, after an incident a week ago, and this is a true story by the way, I might never go back to the circus again. Four of my children are still in hospital, each with, well, terrible, grave injuries. I blame the tightrope walker, Cyrus Sterling. He'd been ill that day with the flu, but had insisted on performing nonetheless. What? His wife objected. She was the circus's wild animal trainer. She said, no, you should take the night off. But he'd replied, you can't have a circus without a high wire act. To which she'd said, yes, you can. That night, in front of 2,000 people, was a full tent. Cyrus began his high wire walk, 70 feet up in the air. 10 feet in, another 50 to go. He felt the wire was unsteady, but he knew that he, in fact, was shaking, not the wire itself. He'd been doing this same act for 15 years, a few nights a week, never with an incident. Until a year ago, he'd had a net beneath him, but he'd felt so practiced and confident that he'd asked the circus to remove the net. That way the act would seem the more dramatic. They'd agreed. Each night he'd climb a pylon in the dark while the jugglers juggled chairs and stools and fire torches. Then, when he was 10 feet or so into his walk, there'd be a bang like an explosion. There'd be a cloud of smoke, and everyone's attention would be drawn up to him as if he'd magically appeared there, and his costume would light up in a burst of colours. As happened tonight too. On an ordinary night, about halfway through his walk, he'd suddenly feign a crisis of confidence. His posture stiffened, his movements became shaky. He'd pretend to lose his balance and tremble, one leg slipping off as if he was feeling faint. Oh, the crowd would love it. They'd breathe in their fright, mouths agape. And then, as his shaking grew even worse, his balancing pole would slip from his grasp. His assistant, a slightly built teenage girl, would cry out, oh no, and hold a wooden bucket to catch his fall in case he fell. That was how a normal night would go. Tonight, however, he trembled in fact, and not as part of any act. He said to himself, look, it's okay. I know what it's like to tremble. I do it every night, and I never fall. 50 feet to go, not far. I can keep the balancing pole the whole way through. He was feeling faint, feverish and faint, flimsy in his balance. All the circus performers standing together, and his wife most of all, knew that something was very wrong. Only his wife knew that he was sick. His assistant had put down the bucket. She was afraid. Then, for the briefest moment, half a second if that, no longer, he lost consciousness. It appeared to those below as a shudder that everyone saw. He fell. He fell straight, not off the wire, but onto the wire, legs apart with the wire between them. When he woke, a moment later, he no longer held the pole. It had fallen. The crowd knew this was not an act. This was not meant to happen. He grabbed the wire with his hands. As he stood up from this sitting position, adrenaline washed through his veins, and he began to walk, each step a memory, a mechanical action, one foot after another, deliberate and precise, a stride like a march, all the way to the end, somehow. I did it, he shouted. The performers grabbed one another in celebration, with his wife at the center in tears. The audience was stunned. They cheered as loudly as they could, as loudly as the performers did. Cyrus hugged the pylon. The show's producers knew to shine the light on him for a moment or two or three, and then away to to the next act, for the show must go on. His wife's act was next. 4 shirtless men, themselves built like lions, wheeled the lion's cage into the middle of the tent. She entered. "Ha!" she shouted. "Ha!" her lashing whip in command. Cyrus, meanwhile, began in the darkness to climb down the rungs of the pylon. There were 12 lions here in the cage, and she had them doing many tricks, sitting on 12 stools, standing on their hind legs at her whip's instruction. They jumped through hoops. She bounced beach balls against their noses. Then 2 lions bounced the ball back and forth. She even put her head into a growling lion's mouth, to the crowd's cheering horror. While her head was inside there, she heard a clap. Not a sound she'd heard before, but she knew immediately what had happened, and rushed out of the lion's mouth and out of the cage. With 20 feet left in his descent, Cyrus had lost his footing and fallen onto his back. The paramedics were there already. One had a stretcher. At first, Cyrus couldn't move and thought he might be paralyzed, but he was okay. He moved his legs, lifted an arm, gave a thumbs up, and he sat up. The lions, meanwhile, all 12 of them, unsupervised now, left the cage because Cyrus's wife, in her rush and distress, had not closed the cage door. The lions were loose in the circus tent. The front rows, that's where I was sitting with my family, stood and turned, thinking to run, but there was nowhere to run. Those in the rows behind us were already clamoring for the exits, trying to flee. The lions became wild hunters amongst wildebeest on the Tanzanian plains. The audience's relief that the tightrope walker had made it across the tightrope and survived a fall and seemed okay became a more immediate concern, not about the safety of others, but about their own lives. This time, the audience's dread was not expressed in silence, but rather was full of shouting. As is often the case today, this circus was having trouble financially and would save money by feeding the lions a minimum of food and only after the show was over. These animals expected to feed now. They had to be recaptured or tranquilized, but there was no gun. No one could find the security person, Ryland, and does he even carry a gun? It was about to become a most terrible scene.